everyone. I'm Elise Thompson Richards, editor-in-chief of Food Engineering. In this interview, I'm chatting with Rob Dongoski, global lead for food and agribusiness at Carney. Dongoski discusses how the U.S. food system is facing structural change driven by demographics, health trends, and geopolitics, how food companies are integrating automation and AI, and more. Let's get started. Hello, Rob. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Elise. Thanks for having me.
And so I'd love to start our conversation by getting to know you a little bit better. Can you tell us about yourself and your role at Kearney?
Sure. My role at Carney is I lead agriculture and food for us on a global basis as well as in the Americas. My background is mostly, kind of upstream around strategy and commercial topics, a lot of innovation, fair bit of M&A. Historically, I've worked across the food system, but have a strong background in agriculture economics as well.
Very cool. And so my understanding is that Carney recently published a report called the Food System Outlook Report, covering some of the macro trends that are affecting all segments of the food industry. So I would love if you could give us a little bit of overview of what you found.
Yeah, there's a few things, so we've been seeing kind of signals, hints, whispers of the food system changing, over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. I think, probably most pronounced right now is a complete alignment of regulations and consumer preferences that really has convinced us that, we're on the precipice of a structural and systemic change to the food system here in the US. And it's not because the US market is so large and so such a central point to the world. There's global impacts as well to some of the things that we're doing, and so you can't just say only the U.S., but in many cases, the U.S., on the downside food system is going to look a lot like the rest of the world.
And so when you say these, major realignment, major shift, what exactly do you mean by that?
It's a few different points. So, I mean, I think we're seeing demand shifts, demand shifts on demographics where you think about Gen Zs, millennials being the majority of our population. Their food tendencies are very different than their Gen X and baby boomer generation. So, definitely some demographic shifts. Migration patterns also drives that to more ethnic foods. And you find, even in the US, you find that, people are putting ethnic foods in their diets routinely. It's not seen as a let's try something different kind of experience. So demographics is a big play. The other big play is just the trend towards health, and so health is a major topic across all generations, but certainly is changing the focus on food. And then the last one, that we can't ignore right now is just geopolitics, and so that'll affect trade routes. It'll affect lots of different things as we think about it. But geopolitics has continued to play on the demand side. Systemically, we're seeing consolidation, traceability, shift from processed foods to fresh. That's really going to affect some of the systemic elements. And then in the innovation areas, I mean, we're seeing products reformulated, much greater use of robotics and automation, and science is back at the table. And so whether that's food ingredients or it's genetics and plants, we're seeing science, potentially playing a much bigger role going forward.
Mhm. And of course, you brought up the idea of the geopolitical landscape. I'd like to talk about the economic landscape as well. Specifically, what sort of economic trends or challenges are shaping food manufacturing?
Well, there's definitely an opportunity and a need to manage food costs. There's no doubt about it. I think we saw, consumers kind of at the brink on food inflation. I think some tempering is starting to happen, but there's definitely a focus on cost, and that can come forward in, managing raw input costs, packaging, lots of different things, right? The second thing is the generations will shift their consumer buying patterns. So, boomers and Xers have always been conditioned to buy food as cheap as possible, and that's why, you know, we've engineered a food system to be as reasonably priced as possible. In the US, it's less than 8% of our disposable income, right? And so that's really important. But when you look at Gen Z millennials, they may shift their buying patterns away from things like automotive and housing to spend more on food. It's one of those things they're more reluctant to cut costs there than they are in other areas. So that's an important piece, and it feeds into, I mean, ultimately why we think this is really, fundamental change is because Gen Z, or millennials creating Gen Alpha, so Gen Alpha will be raised in a different context as well.
Hmm. And so thinking about this idea of maybe younger consumers and getting up to middle-aged consumers now. Um,
We like the
you-
term, Gen X or baby boomer versus middle age, but go ahead.
well, I mean, us millennials, as a millennial myself, we're getting older too, so it's hard to ignore that. But thinking of this idea of not being willing to, cut costs on food or not being willing to go as cheap as possible, is that because of the interest in health and sustainability? Sustainability?
Yeah, it's a couple things. It's a great question. It's definitely because of health. It's definitely because of more conscious and more visible appreciation for the planet and how food's produced. But it's also largely driven by status. And so we see dramatic differences in how generations view food and status, and in that middle-aged or Gen X baby boomer generation, status was always cars and houses. You had a better car, bigger house, you're probably considered more successful. It's interesting to watch younger generations who don't talk about going to the grocery store. They talk about going to Whole Foods or Sprouts or Fresh Market. If they're shopping at Aldi's, they're probably going to not tell you, or it's not that we went out to eat with a couple friends. It's what we went to this restaurant that takes 3 months to get into, or it's the latest one that just opened 3 months ago, everybody's talking about. So that kind of status of food is very different among those generations.
And so, how can manufacturers take advantage of that or take that into consideration when they're developing products or developing manufacturing processes?
Yeah, this is exactly what we're working with our clients on, Elise, is, how do you fundamentally change your portfolio to match where consumer trends are going? So there's a few things we think about and we're working on with the clients. So one is around increased consumer intelligence. How do you use AI to blend in all your grocery store scanner data, your internal data, um, social media, listening? How do you put all that into a package that says, here's what I think our products match the best to, or here's how we tweak our products to appeal to the segments we want to. So I think that's a really big piece is around consumer intelligence. The other is a deeper diagnosis of how our food is produced and what's in the contents, particularly around packaged food. When you look at the trend lines, it would say, ideally, I would like to have 5 ingredients or less in every one of my foods. Bag, box, can, don't care. And that trend is really important, but very, very difficult when you're trying to have long shelf lives. You're trying to do lots of things to keep food, really, less expensive and so forth. So that's the key, I think, is really to understand the trade-offs in your portfolio of how you can do those things together.
Hmm. And so, of course, this is a topic that's dominating headlines and it has been for a while, but I wanted to ask about tariffs as well. Specifically, how have tariffs complicated supply chains in the US for food manufacturers? And do you have any insights on how manufacturers can handle these interruptions?
Yeah, I think the number one thing tariffs has done is created uncertainty, and so like when you think about, 85 to 90% of our food that we consume in the US is grown in the US, and so, that's a big number, and so, um, with that, we're a little bit immune in the food system to tariff impacts, but not entirely. But I think the biggest impact is it's just created uncertainty. But I don't think that's really the most important, aspect of the current administration that's affecting the food system. I think it's much more around regulatory impacts in state level bans, SNAP benefits, MAHA, all those sorts of things. Then you shift over to consumer preferences, like we've already talked about, plus GLP-1s, I think that has a much bigger impact on our food system today than tariffs do.
Hmm. And you mentioned this idea that the majority of our food is grown and made here. But in the manufacturing sector, there's been a lot of talk about reshoring. Does that affect the food manufacturing industry at all?
It affects the food system in a pretty big way,
Hmm.
right? So, you know, roughly 30 to 50% of our uh, fresh foods imported. And so you see that in Mexico's from avocado, blueberries from Peru and so forth, 70 to 80, 90% of our seafood's imported. So, those kind of fresh, pieces, fresh elements of our food system, they definitely have an opportunity to be, we'll call them reshored. The challenge is, I think when you look at the fresh category, which, very different than the packaged category, right? So building more packaged plants on shore isn't really that interesting, from a reshoring or impact on the food system, because a lot of those are, you're built close to where your consumers are at. You're not shipping necessarily food from Europe to the US or Asia to the US, and in from a package standpoint, not dramatically. But on the fresh category, 85, 80 to 85% of that fruit and vegetable nut category comes out of California, Central Valley, California. And so when you look at that and you go, well, how can we, buy blueberries cheaper from Peru than we can from our own domestic US? You got to really look at what's going on in California, where, the cost per acre to comply with regulations is about $1,600 an acre just to comply with regulations. So when I think about reshoring, I think about inshoring, moving around. Do we start to grow things outside California, maybe Mississippi Delta region, other parts of the US? Do we use alternative growing techniques like greenhouses, indoor things like that really make us competitive in the US against some of these other countries?
And how do you recommend that we do something like that to become more competitive and move around some of the agriculture, as you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is our national food policy. I mean, do we look at that as a country and see that, we're losing to some competition outside, I think that'll get greater scrutiny as we continue to look at our relationships with other countries and where things are produced and so forth. But I also think it's, how do we spur innovation? I mean, I think that's the number one unlock. How do you incent someone in, northern Mississippi, western Tennessee to, get into large scale blueberry or lettuce production, something like that? How do you incent them to take that risk versus going down the historical path of, you know, my dad, my grandfather, my great grandfather all planted corn and soy. Therefore, my easy out is to go plant more corn and soy. Um, yeah, how do we start to shift that through some incentive programs? The farm bill itself, again, 75% of the farm bill goes to supplemental nutrition, but the part that does go to farmers is largely overweighted to corn and soy farmers. So how do we start to put some money in people's pockets to try some different things?
Hmm. And so thinking about the manufacturing side of things, I feel like that's going to require some investment as well. In your view, are food manufacturers continuing to invest in capital projects to expand it and optimize their operations?
It's a great question. We actually just did a project with a client around capital investment and trying to really center in on, precision placement of capital is the way to think about it. And what I would say in this time of uncertainty, there's reluctance to spend, money on big capital projects, because we don't know, you know, those are, typically 2, 3 year, out on returns. And to invest now and not know the certainty of what's going to happen in 2, 3 years is putting a bit of a stall in some of the larger capital investments. So that's why precision becomes really important. Is there a clear business case? Do we have confidence that this capital investment is going to pay off? And so I do see a little, not let's say a slowdown, but some reluctance and maybe some extra diligence before that expenditure is approved.
Hmm. And that's a great segue into my next question. Do you feel like manufacturers are adopting or hastening to adopt technological solutions that may be quicker and easier to install or implement over versus a huge capital expenditure project, but it might help them in these difficult economic times? Is that what you're seeing, or no?
No, absolutely. And it's interesting when we say technology because it can be applied in a lot of different ways, right? We always think about kind of the Silicon Valley tech, right? But I think there's a lot of experimentation going on in a lot of different areas. So whether that's robotics, automation, things like that, we're seeing a lot of experimentation. So I don't think that side of technologies, slowing down at all. I do think that we've seen some pullback on certain kinds of technology, like indoor farming is a good example. We've seen a history over the last 2, 3 years of some, some struggles there. Now, does that mean the technology wasn't right, or does it mean the application of the technology wasn't right? I think, we've got to look at that in a big way. The other one, I would say, the two other areas that are just no-brainers, plant automation continues to be and I say plant automation, I think just automation in general, whether that means harvesting of soft berries or that means plant automation inside the four walls, that continues to be a major piece of technology application for a number of reasons. Cost is one, but more importantly, it's just labor availability, and so you see that in plants, you see that in quick serve restaurants across the food system. That's the big one. The technology that we haven't really even touched yet is AI. Okay. And, you know, we can't have a conversation these days without talking about AI. AI is so much different than previous technologies, like put it in categories of digital, internet, what go back as far as you want, and where it was develop a strategy, deploy it to the enterprise. AI, the way we're using it and the way we're working with our clients is very targeted on specific business problems, you know? And so how do we solve some of the most complex problems that just candidly the human mind doesn't have the capacity or computational power to finish? Where let's bring AI in to bring all that together. So AI, I think, will be you know, uh, again, we're early, but I think it's going to be a tremendous application of technology as we go forward.
Broadly, can you speak about any examples that you've worked on with customers as far as implementing AI?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we've got a couple different things we're working on. So one, in the upstream ag space, we're looking at, where crops are grown, how seed is moved from the big seed suppliers through the ag retail networks, to farmers, and where's that going? And do you have the right stores in the right places? Do you have the right archetypes? And so we're combining, both publicly available data, geospatial data, customer or client data into there to say, how do we know we have the right footprint? How can we optimize that footprint and evaluate it differently? And then what happens if shifts over time, like we were talking about, specialty crops in the Delta. What happens if that moves in that direction? How quickly can you adapt? So we're using an AI capability to solve that for our clients.
Wow, that's very cool. It seems like the options are endless as far as what AI can do for farmers, of course, and for manufacturers as well.
Yeah, no question. The other one is downstream. So we look at food. I kind of mentioned it earlier a little bit, but if you take, if you're a food manufacturer, you're thinking where are consumers going? Historically, you grab grocery store, scanner data. You look at your own data. You say, okay, what makes sense and what do I do? You do some, demand sensing for your own supply chain, but you also do consumer intelligence in a variety of ways. But now you think about, having AI with the ability to combine grocery store scanner data, your own sales data, other customer, consumer intelligence data you're gathering, and also social listening. So put all those together and then use AI in a way that says, what really is this telling you? I think that is a tremendous opportunity, particularly in what we talked about earlier around our portfolios, responding to generations, what's the formulation need to look like? I mean, all of a sudden we have a whole different tool in the toolbox.
Absolutely. And so you talk about AI, you talk about automation and robotics, and that leads me to my next question is what steps are food companies taking to become more resilient in the face of these economic challenges? And what steps should they be taking if they aren't taking them already?
Yeah, and this is, we have some clients that are very much in a we've got it figured out mode, and with their talent and with all respect, they're figuring it out on their own pace and own recognition of where they're at. And we have other clients that are like, we see, storms on the horizon, we need to react fast. So we're seeing kind of an array across there. But the clients that we're working with, and what we see pretty consistently is first of, not in order, but one of the things they're looking at is look at my network, my manufacturer, my distribution network. Am I in the right places? Do I have plants? Looking at my portfolio, do I have plants that may not be running at high efficiency, then I need to think about what to do with those in the future. Do I repurpose them? Do I close them? And so that's a big piece. If you look at, that network, that same network around logistics, and you think through, um, do I have my goods in the right place to be efficient in how I distribute? And if I'm moving, you know, into more fresh categories, how do I optimize to hit the consumer's need to be fresh and local? Shipping lettuce from West Coast to East Coast doesn't satisfy fresh and local, so we've seen some players, build new sites in the Midwest so they can be more fresh and local. So almost dual headquartering to some degree. So network becomes a big factor. Um, Portfolio is the other one, which drives a lot of the network decisions. What's in my portfolio today? When I look at the state level bans around certain ingredients, we're working with clients trying to, bring government relations into the conversation to say, what do you think is going to happen? And then that puts procurement into the conversation. What ingredients do I need? So we can reformulate products to comply. So what's the cost to comply? Or am I better off just letting that product run out because maybe long-term demand doesn't look strong? So why would I reformulate? So that becomes a big issue. The third issue is around supplier relationships, and I've got to have more flexibility in my ingredient stacks and ability to get the ingredients I need. We've seen shocks to the system, when you look at a few years ago it was vanilla beans, last couple of years was cocoa. The question is, do I have any highly volatile ingredients that could drive a supply shock to me, price shock, and what are my alternatives? Excuse me. And it may not just be, excuse me, it may not just be a commodity ingredient. It could be a supplier. What happens if a supplier goes bust? Do I have the right number of suppliers, the right relationships? Do I need to co-invest into that relationship with that supplier so they can do things more efficiently? And then the last one I think we've already talked about, which is how do I use AI for consumer intelligence and demand sensing? So there's lots of opportunity around supply chain planning using AI.
Definitely. And so thinking about these technological solutions, thinking about these economic concerns, the geopolitical concerns, supply concerns. How do you think all of these things are going to shape the food industry within the next 5 to 10 years?
I think we're going to continue to see food costs, be managed. We can't have food costs. Everything we talked about can't make food, increase by 50%, right? That's just, a non-starter. Um, Consumers will continue to buy food off of two primary decision factors, which is taste and affordability. I don't see those changing. It's been that way for a long time. Don't see it changing. The question is, what's that third criteria? What's that third criteria that consumers are looking for? Is it healthy? Is it convenient? Trust is playing a bigger role in the food system now. Is my company, is my brand trusted? So I think that's a big piece. Um, I think the spending shift between, housing, real estate, things like that over to, or real estate and automotive, over to food, I think is a real question of how dramatically does that go, and then in the US, you got to think about health spending, which is, 20+% of our GDP, do we start to shift money away from health over to food? And at some level, you ask, what's the difference? So I think that's another element. And the last one I just say is, kind of in that vein, do we start to create incentives that merge food and health? So if you eat better, exercise, don't do the things that drive healthcare costs higher, will you be rewarded in the future? It's kind of like if you're a good, safe driver for 20 years, your premium's probably lower than someone who crashes a lot, right? And so do we see those same incentives move across the food system?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about. And looking at my list here, those are all the questions I had. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss that we didn't touch on?
No, I mean, I guess I'd leave you with this is, I mean, I think we've heard a lot of people talk about food system transformation. The whole thing's going to be upended and so forth. We've heard this for a long time, right? And um, but I think the people who discern of what really is going on are the clients, companies that will win, and so I I really do believe we're on a kind of the precipice of change. And I think with any big change creates opportunity, and so we may sit here in 5 years, 10 years, and a lot of companies we've grown up with, and we know they may not have moved fast enough to stay. But I think what ends up happening is you got to look at your company persona. What are we known for? And what do we want to be known for in the future? And I'm always a believer that kind of mission vision kind of stays constant in a company. This may be a case where you got to reevaluate what exactly are we in business for, and what's our persona, and how dramatically do we need to change to capitalize on the future. It's one of those, if you change fast enough, you'll be a winner, and if you don't, it may be on the other side.
I think that's good advice for anyone in any industry. And so thank you, Rob, so much for spending your time with me and sharing your expertise. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Elise. I appreciate you inviting us.